I'm Pastor Noel Schoonmaker. I want to welcome you to Wednesday Bible Study here at Second Baptist Church of Richmond. We are currently in a study called Galatians in Slow Motion. We are looking at Paul's letter to the Galatians, and we are studying it slowly, deliberately, verse by verse, to grow in our understanding and in our faith. Today, we will consider Galatians chapter 2, verses 9 through 12. So let's begin with Galatians 2, verse 9. And acknowledging the grace that was given to me, James and Cephas and John, the ones seeming to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, in order that we should be for the Gentiles, but they for the circumcision. The Jerusalem apostles acknowledged the grace given to Paul. The Greek term charis, translated grace, is a seminal concept in Paul's theology. Here it refers to a gift God gives someone for carrying out a task effectively. In Paul's theology, a measure of grace is given to each Christian for the building up of the body of Christ. The idea is that Paul's effective missionary work among the Gentiles was not due to his own merit or his own spiritual prowess, but rather to the grace God had given him to be an effective missionary. For the first time, Paul names the Jerusalem apostles that he went up to Jerusalem to meet: James, Cephas, and John. The James mentioned here would be James, the brother of the Lord, rather than James, the son of Zebedee. According to Acts chapter 12, verse 2, James, the son of Zebedee, was martyred by Herod Agrippa. Since Agrippa reigned from 41 to 44 CE, James, the son of Zebedee, would have been martyred by 44 CE, and therefore he would have been deceased by the time of which Paul speaks. It is noteworthy that James, the brother of the Lord, is mentioned first. Although Peter was the head of the earliest church, James eventually became the principal administrative leader of the church in Jerusalem. The John mentioned in verse 9 would be John, the son of Zebedee, the brother of the martyred James. This is the only instance in Paul's letters where John is mentioned. John was in the inner circle of Jesus' disciples and a constant associate of Peter in the earliest days of the Christian movement. John always played a secondary role, however, and he was not as prominent as Peter or James, although he did, of course, exercise abiding influence as a source for and perhaps author of the Gospel of John and the Epistles of John. Paul refers to James, Peter, and John not as pillars, but as the ones seeming to be pillars. The reason is that Paul wants to reference their authority, since they blessed his law-free gospel to the Gentiles, while Paul also wants to deny that their authority is greater than his, since the Judaizers or false teachers were seeking to undermine Paul's authority in comparison to these three Jerusalem apostles. The Greek word translated pillars is stuloi, a common architectural term for a supporting column. In terms of the Old Testament, it evokes the supports that held up the tabernacle and the columns that held up the temple. In terms of the New Testament, wherein the church is likened to a spiritual building with Christ as the foundation, this term evoked the image of strong believers upholding the community. The same Greek term appears in Revelation 3, verse 12, which features end times imagery in a similar vein, saying, "If you conquer, I will make you a pillar in the temple of my God." Ancient Jewish teaching in the Talmud identified Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as the pillars of Israel. These three patriarchs of God's people may have inspired the early Christians in Jerusalem, who were largely Jewish in background, to identify three analogous pillars or patriarchs of their Christian community. Perhaps Peter, James, and John were the New Testament counterparts to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The image of pillars gives modern-day Christians pause to ask whether we are serving as supports for the church or mere ornaments. Are we contributing to the Christian community in such a way that our service upholds the church, or are we functioning more like a superfluous furnishing, which, if removed, would scarcely change a thing? Worse still, could we be engaging in activities such as gossip or dissension that could serve to bring down rather than build up the church? It's important to test ourselves with these and other introspective inquiries. The phrase about the right hand of fellowship is an ancient idiom that conveyed the idea of pledging friendship or recognizing an agreement. In Ezra 10:19, for example, certain men gave their hands to send away their wives, meaning they made a pledge to send away their wives. In the context of Galatians 2:9, Peter, James, and John made an agreement with Paul and Barnabas that Peter and his companions would evangelize the Jews, while Paul and his companions would evangelize the Gentiles. Then they shook on it. They made a deal verbally and confirmed it by the ancient physical gesture of shaking hands. Although the Old Testament idiom about giving the hand often implied that one party was superior, Paul was careful to indicate that the Jerusalem pillars gave him the right hand of fellowship. The Greek term translated fellowship is koinonia, which connotes a mutual partnership of equals. Paul is relating that the agreement he and Barnabas reached with the Jerusalem pillars was a mutual partnership between equals for the purpose of reaching Jews and Gentiles with the gospel of Christ. On to verse 10. They only asked that we should go on remembering the poor, the very thing that I also was eager to do. Verse 10 starts with the Greek term monon, which means only. Paul is indicating that there was only one condition attached to his agreement with the Jerusalem pillars, namely, that Paul and his associates would continue to remember the poor. Although English translations often say that we remember the poor, the Greek verb suggests the continuation of an action already underway, or that they would go on remembering the poor. In other words, Paul had long made a habit of remembering the poor, and he would continue to do so. The Greek term translated poor is tokoi, which designates economically disadvantaged Christians in Jerusalem. To remember the poor means not only to keep them in mind, but also to support them financially. Assisting the impoverished was a central aspect of both Jewish and Christian piety. So it was quite natural for Paul to embrace the ministry of supporting the destitute within the Jerusalem church. He adds that it was the exact thing he was eager to do anyhow. Paul may have in mind the collection that he and Barnabas had recently taken from Antioch to Jerusalem for the purpose of famine relief, as mentioned in Acts 11, verse 30. In any case, Paul viewed remembering the poor as a welcome addition to his agreement with the Jerusalem apostles. The phrase about remembering the poor bears important implications for modern-day Christians, primarily because it is often easy to forget about the poor. Housing patterns frequently serve to distance middle and upper class persons from persons of meager economic means. Middle and upper class people normally inhabit schools, stores, and areas of town that do not require much interaction with impoverished people. When poor people are out of sight, they are often out of mind. This is why Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin, leaders of the 20th century Catholic worker movement, emphasized the importance of intentionally remembering those who are poor. To remember the poor is to keep them constantly in mind and to utilize our social and economic capital for their benefit. To remember the poor is to ask where low-income residents are going to live once their housing complex is demolished for the sake of downtown revitalization. To remember the poor is to ask how every policy considered in a state legislature will affect people that have little money. To remember the poor is to allot a portion of one's household budget to relieve the needs of families that are living below the poverty line. To remember the poor is to partner with churches and other organizations in efforts to resource and empower persons who are oppressed. To remember the poor is to learn the names of homeless persons in town. To remember the poor is to dream for all children what we dream for our own children. Remembering the poor is no optional feature of Christian discipleship. It is imperative. Now for verse 11. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I stood against him to his face, because he had been condemned. According to verses 1 through 10 in chapter 2, Paul and Peter had reached an agreement in Jerusalem that circumcision would not be required of Gentile converts to Christ. But between verses 10 and 11, Paul and Peter went from handshake to showdown. The transition is abrupt. The Greek phrase translated, "but when," marks the shift from harmony at Jerusalem to conflict at Antioch. Antioch was a major city in northern Syria and the third largest city in the Roman Empire. Much like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles are three leading cities in the United States today, back then, Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch were leading cities of the Roman Empire. As a major urban center, Antioch had substantial populations of both Jews and Gentiles. In fact, the Jewish historian Josephus indicates that a considerable Jewish population intermingled freely with Gentiles in Antioch. It is probable that many residents of Antioch were God-fearers, that is, Gentiles that honored the God of Israel in synagogue worship. Given this social milieu, it is not difficult to see how a multicultural Christian community developed in Antioch. Although the agreement between Paul and the Jerusalem apostles had settled the question of circumcision, it had not covered all the issues that would surface in the multicultural Christian communities of Antioch. Specifically, Paul and Peter had not reached an agreement about how table fellowship between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians would work in relation to Old Testament dietary laws. The problem at Antioch was not circumcision, but table fellowship. Although it appears that common meals were the primary point of contention, the problem likely encompassed the Lord's Supper as well, since early Pauline churches celebrated the Lord's Supper in combination with a fellowship meal. If the Lord's Supper had been the sole issue, Paul likely would have made theological arguments directly related to the Lord's Supper, as he does in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 17 through 34. If common table fellowship had been the sole issue, one would expect Paul to have said something like, "How can you take the cup of the Lord's blood and the bread of his body together and then separate yourselves at lunchtime. So it appears, as Bible scholar Richard Hayes says, that Peter, Barnabas, and other Jewish Christians were not celebrating the Lord's Supper with the Gentile Christians in Antioch. The problem, therefore, can be summarized as a lack of table fellowship between Jewish Christians, especially Peter, and Gentile Christians, at both common meals and at the Lord's Supper. Table fellowship between Jews and Gentiles was a dicey topic in antiquity, and the broader social tensions pertaining to it appear to have filtered into the church. Although Old Testament law does not prohibit Jews from eating with Gentiles, it contains many stipulations regulating what Jews are allowed to eat precisely for the purpose of distinguishing them from Gentiles. Foods such as pork and shellfish, for example, are identified as unclean in Old Testament law. Meat associated with idol worship and meat that had not been cooked thoroughly enough to remove the blood of the animal were also prohibited in the Jewish diet. Now, theoretically speaking, a strictly observant Jew could share table fellowship with Gentiles without incurring defilement. But practically speaking, there was an assumption among some ancient Jewish persons that eating at the same table with Gentile persons could bring defilement. This assumption is evident in ancient Jewish literature. The letter of Aristeas from the 2nd century BCE says, "To prevent our being perverted by contact with others or by mixing with bad influences, Moses hedged us in on all sides with strict observances connected with meat and drink and touch and hearing and sight after the manner of the law." The book of Jubilees states, "Eat not with them, for their works are unclean." The Roman historian Tacitus adds that Jews eat separately from other people. Essentially, it appears that some Jewish persons invoked the slippery slope argument when discussing the question of table fellowship with Gentiles. They argued that Jews who fraternize with Gentiles around the table might compromise their own holiness. For Christians, however, Jesus Christ is the paradigm of holiness. His type of holiness involves fellowship with those who are ethnically and culturally different, as we see in his conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4. Jesus' type of holiness even involves table fellowship with sinners, as we see in the story of Jesus having dinner at Levi's house in Luke chapter 5. According to Jesus' example, risking one's own set-apartness for the purpose of building relationships with others is holier than withdrawing in order to guard one's set-apartness. If Jesus is the exemplar of holiness, then holiness is not an exercise in disassociation, but rather an exercise in inclusive love. Paul understood the situation at Antioch in similar terms. In Paul's view, the lack of table fellowship between Peter and Gentile Christians was so dire that he confronted Peter to his face about it. He stood against Peter in a firm and public manner. The intensity of Paul's feeling is revealed in the phrase translated, "had been condemned." The implication is that God had condemned Peter for his actions. English translations that describe Peter as in the wrong or self-condemned fail to capture the weight of Paul's word choice here. In Paul's mind, Peter had done something so unethical that it garnered divine condemnation. He explains Peter's offense in verse 12, which says, "For before certain people came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he was drawing back and was separating himself, fearing those of the circumcision." The Greek term synasthein is in the imperfect tense, indicating that Peter had made a habit of eating with Gentile Christians before certain people from James appeared on the scene. Although we do not know exactly who these people were, we can safely infer that they were Jewish Christians from Jerusalem that James had dispatched to Antioch. Bible scholar F.F. Bruce identifies these men with the false brothers mentioned in verse 4 and suggests that their message to Peter went something like this: "News is reaching us in Jerusalem that you are habitually practicing table fellowship with Gentiles. This is causing grave scandal to our more conservative brethren here. Not only so, it is becoming common knowledge outside the church, so that our attempts to evangelize our fellow Jews are being seriously hampered." Bible scholar Robert Jewett notes that during this period of time, there was a resurgence of the Zealot movement within Judaism. Zealots were Jewish freedom fighters that advocated armed resistance to Roman rule. So they would have viewed Jews that were friendly with Gentiles as traitors. It's plausible, therefore, that Jewish zealots were pressuring James and other Jewish Christians in Jerusalem to convince Peter to stop associating with Gentiles in Antioch in order to preserve the purity of the Jewish tradition. Whatever the details may have been, the general picture is clear. Peter made a habit of eating with Gentile Christians in Antioch until James sent a group of Jewish Christians from Jerusalem to Antioch. This group pressured Peter to avoid table fellowship with Gentile Christians, and Peter caved. Remember that this is the same man who denied Jesus 3 times when it was unpopular to be associated with him. It comes as little surprise that Peter gave way to pressure again. Paul could hear the cock crowing every time Peter refused to join the Gentile Christians for dinner. The Greek phrase translated, "he was drawing back and was separating himself," features 2 verbs in the imperfect tense. According to Bruce, the double imperfect conveys that Peter did not make an abrupt break with his former practice, but proceeded to change it gradually. It was not the case that men from James arrived one afternoon and Peter stopped eating with Gentile Christians that same night at dinner time. It was more like the men from James arrived and started giving Peter a hard time about eating with Gentile Christians. For a few days, Peter shook off their criticism and maintained his practice. But over the period of a week or 2, the men from James wore him down so that he started eating with them at every meal and never sat with Gentile Christians. Peter's gradual capitulation offers an important lesson. Christians often give way to sin gradually rather than instantaneously. The tempter does not always fire his entire quiver of arrows at once. He often takes a slow and deliberate approach. It may take 40 days for the process of temptation to reach its apex, as we see with Jesus' temptation in the wilderness recorded in Matthew chapter 4. Many times, when Christians fall away from church and lose the vitality of their faith, it does not happen all at once. Instead, it starts with something harmless like going on summer vacation and missing a couple of Sundays in a row. Then perhaps someone in the family gets sick the following weekend, so everyone stays home. The next Sunday, fatigue keeps the family out of church. And the next couple of Sundays, they have sports commitments out of town. And before they know it, they haven't been to church in 2 or 3 months, and they are out of the habit of attending. While some abandoned church in one quick swoop due to a conscious renunciation of their faith or a horrible experience they had at church one day, many simply get out of the habit of attending over time. Social pressure is also something that mounts over time. It can wear us down to the point where we forsake our own convictions. When I was a youth minister several years ago, there was a student in the youth group named Casey. Casey had a rough group of friends, but he had gotten involved with our church and really seemed to like it. He started worshiping with the church on Sundays and started reading his Bible and started praying and coming to youth group weekly. He even went to summer camp with us. One night at summer camp, he confessed a sin to our group that brought him to tears. He said that the previous weekend he had gone to a party. A girl approached him there and told him she liked his necklace, which featured a cross. She asked him what it meant and if he was a Christian. And he said, "No, it's just something I wear." As Casey relayed this story, tears began to roll down his face. He said, "I felt like I was denying Christ." For Peter, for Casey, and for any believer, it can be difficult to maintain Christian integrity and spiritual strength amid adverse social environments. But by growing daily in our Christian faith, we can avoid the gradual descent into sin that Peter experienced at Antioch. The final phrase of verse 12 indicates that Peter gave way due to fear. The text says he feared the circumcision. Does this mean he feared Jewish people, or Jewish Christians, or the false teachers, or the Jewish zealots in Jerusalem? Bible scholars Richard Longenecker and F.F. Bruce suggest that Peter feared zealots in Jerusalem. When religious zealots become violent, there is certainly reason to fear for one's safety. Perhaps Peter's fear was legitimate, even if his behavior was immoral. Fear can certainly cause immorality. This is one reason that courage has been identified as the chief of all virtues. Without courage in the face of fear, one is incapable of practicing any other virtue, such as honesty, integrity, love, righteousness, and so on. Although Peter might have feared the Jewish zealots, the majority of scholars have concluded that Peter feared the Jewish Christians from Jerusalem who had come from James, presumably because they threatened to break fellowship with the church at Antioch if Peter continued to be so friendly toward Gentile Christians. If this scenario is accurate, then Peter may have decided to stop eating with Gentile Christians in order to preserve the overall fellowship between the Jewish Christian church at Jerusalem and the church at Antioch, made up largely of Gentiles. But Paul denied the legitimacy of this maneuver on the grounds that it was not worth sacrificing the truth of the gospel to appease Jewish Christian leaders in Jerusalem. That's all for now. I hope to see you next time when we pick up in verse 13. The Lord bless you and keep you.